To the town of our free rode a stranger one fine day. Hardly spoke to folks around him, didn't have too much to say. No one dared to ask his business, no one dared to make a slip. The stranger there among them had a big iron on his hip, big iron on his hip.
Picture yourself in the old American West. What do you see? Perhaps open ranges, dramatic mountains in the background, and 1,000 head of cattle, cowboys, bandits, and little towns named Gulch. A gunslinger enters the local saloon and steps up to the bar for a drink. Whenever a disagreement is had, it's out to the main street for a high noon duel. As the camera pans across the shooter's hands, a tumbleweed rolls through the dusty street. But how did it get there? The most common species of tumbleweed aren't even native to the American continent, yet they are inseparably connected with images of the American West. They're so iconic that they even show up in parody of the American West. Despite their iconic image and robust nature, steps need to be taken to control spread of the tumbleweed and increase understanding of the problems that they cause. Russian thistle, Calitragus or Salsolatragus, more commonly known as tumbleweed, is not a thistle but actually a variety of saltwort. The word tumbleweed refers to any plant that has anatomy that breaks off and rolls in the wind, allowing the seeds to propagate. Individuals can grow up to 3 feet tall and have taproots that reach depths of over 6 feet. This species is native to arid and semi-arid ecosystems ranging from southern Europe to northern Africa. Individual plants can produce around 200,000 seeds. The plants require very little moisture, being highly adapted to arid climates. All available sources point to a contaminated flaxseed shipment from Ukraine being the first introduction of Russian thistle into the Americas. The primary source of this information is Leicester Hoxie Dewey, an assistant botanist at the USDA, who was appointed to study the weed and make a recommendation for its control. Based on his observations, the weed was first introduced from the aforementioned flaxseed shipment in South Dakota in 1873. Dewey's report was published in 1894, a mere 20 years after its first introduction. In the investigation conducted by the USDA, letters were sent to North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern counties in Iowa, and eastern counties of Wyoming. In his effort to understand the weed and its spread, a large list of questions regarding the weed and its introduction was given, along with a request to send a sample of the weed. This large area concerned about the weed 20 years after its introduction is an example of the potency of Russian thistle and its ability to spread. However, Dewey noted that in wet years, Russian thistle was less of a problem, as it is a poor competitor with other plants in wet climates. Russian thistle first appeared in Colorado in 1892. Presently, Russian thistle is found in every state except for Alaska and Florida. Tumbleweeds are a popular symbol of the empty frontier, desolation, and isolation. This has mostly been propagated by the Western genre of film. The isolated little town that is the favorite setting of the Western is just like the tumbleweed, prickly, resilient, and well-suited to the high desert. The typical protagonist of our story is, like the thistle, suited to growing alone and not being crowded by other plants. This sense of toughness and independence has propagated and become part of the perceived identity of the American West. This has become such a strong image that they can even be purchased online and shipped around the world. The prevalence of the weed has extended beyond the human sphere of influence, and has had an impact on wildlife and their diets. In a Forest Service study done at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, researchers observed that Russian thistle provided less than 10% of nutritional value at times to bison, mule deer, and elk, based on the availability of other food sources. Although the value is marginal, it shows that the human influence exerted on the environment by the introduction of Russian thistle has affected native populations. They may provide some benefit in the form of food to wildlife in areas where they are prevalent. This small benefit seems to be largely outweighed, however, by the negative consequences of its introduction. Whether or not people would miss the icon of the West remains to be seen, but most people that live in areas where they are prevalent will not be sad to see them go. The primary reason behind most people's concerns about Russian thistle is rooted in agriculture. Dewey refers to the area in which the thistle was introduced as a great wheat-growing area. In more recent years, studies have been made of the thistle and its impact on agriculture. Frank L. Young, a research agronomist from the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at Washington State University, has studied the weed and its interaction with wheat for more than 20 years. Monocropping systems implemented in current production leave large swaths of crops more vulnerable to the thistle. In a study observing post-harvest control of the thistle using alternative herbicides, Young states that in the Pacific Northwest, Russian thistle reduces crop yield and decreases quality, costing growers more than $50 million annually. The spring wheat cannot compete well with Russian thistle. Young quantified the impact of Russian thistle on soil moisture as up to 70 liters of water per plant. Left unchecked, it is projected that more than 100 liters per plant of soil moisture can be consumed by Russian thistle, which can prevent growing crops in soil in the coming years. Salsolis tragus has other ill effects. The weed also affects huge swaths of land in northern Africa, Europe, and southeastern Asia. In Iran, researchers from the Tehran University of Medical Science were able to identify Salsola cali as the most common source of aeroallergens in all areas in Iran, as well as referencing other works that identify tumbleweed as a major allergy contributor in the northern hemisphere and Australia. In southeastern Colorado, the lands of the Navajo Nation on the Colorado Plateau feature high percentages of dune fields. The dunes are stabilized by grasses and shrubs, which are being affected by the presence of Russian thistle. As discussed by Young above, in arid climates, Russian thistle significantly reduces soil moisture of other plants in the vicinity. As percentage of the dune area covered by vegetation decreases, dune stability decreases as well. The threshold given in the article is 14 to 16% cover for dune stability. This increases sand movement and threatens the lands and the wildlife that supports the lifestyle of the Navajo Nation. The invasion of the thistle is affecting the lifestyles of natives and immigrants alike, and is a mutual nuisance and threat. The study, performed by researchers from the U.S. Geological Survey, was more focused on native species, and the effect of Salsola on the dunes was not directly quantified, but researchers raised concerns about the rising prevalence of the weed in the lands of the Navajo Nation due to its competitive edge in arid climates. In another study done in the Pacific Northwest region, this time done by a PhD student from the Washington State University Department of Crop and Soil Science Studies, found that Salsola tragus is largely resistant to glyphosate, a primary method of weed control in the area. Due to the long-range dispersal of the weed in a large population, there is a large genetic diversity among the thistle, and developed resistance to herbicides is a concern. Clearly, from allergies to reduced crop yields, evidence suggests that something needs to be done to control spread of Russian thistle. The health of the nation, the wealth of the nation, native culture, and native species are all being directly impacted by its presence and propagation. The government has been aware of the issue for at least 100 years, but legislation alone has not been sufficient to solve the problem. New methods and capabilities are necessary in making this step. Recently, new and interesting ways of controlling the weed have been introduced. Some of particular interest involve biological agents as controls. Researchers from the USDA Foreign Disease Weed Science Research Unit identified a rust fungus, Uromyces salsolae, which is a host-specific fungus that severely debilitates leaves and stems of affected plants. Sample plants were inoculated and examined 4 weeks later. The fungus was also applied to non-targeted native species, and no significant outbreaks occurred. Because the rust propagates via airborne spores, the rust is a good candidate for control, as it does not require specific manual application, and can control areas outside of the original application. The rust would also reduce potential impact to local ecosystems from herbicides. One of the most interesting ideas surrounding control of the pest plant is to control spread of the seeds with ants. At the University of Western Australia in Perth, laboratory tests found high levels of seed removal. In a large field, insecticide was used to remove ants from the field. After 2 months, the number of tumbleweeds in the field had doubled, from 3,383 weeds per hectare compared to 1,948 weeds per hectare in the control field. The researchers proposed low or zero tillage farming methods that promote ant abundance and reduce weeds. The solution is particularly attractive because of its low cost and environmental impact, although it is not known how seed predation will affect naturally dispersed seeds in wildlife areas. Several methods mentioned by Spring in the study in Washington are also attractive and have already been implemented. These methods vary by the time of year in which they are applied. While crops are growing, the health and density of the crop can contribute to success. If the crops are strong enough, they can outcompete the thistle for resources and choke it out. Another method is to use an implement that cuts the taproot of the weed within 2 weeks window of the grain harvest. This method prevents the plant from producing seeds and halts spread of weed growth. Herbicide alternatives to glyphosates can also be used, notably paraquat herbicide. This method is more dependent on the right application conditions to be effective. Implementing these controls and supporting them publicly will increase the viability of agricultural economies worldwide. It will benefit ecosystems by increasing viability of native species that promote soil stability, which in turn supports the native and immigrant human populations in concerned areas. Health benefits will result from decreased allergens resulting from the propagation of the weed. The studies performed will also increase understanding of alternative ecological controls and potentially motivate shifts to heteroculture farming that can reduce environmental impact and decrease susceptibility to invasive species like Russian thistle. So, there are plenty of options for control of the species, but which is best? It seems unlikely that one individual method will be able to effectively curb the spread, although each new development, method, and new understanding brings a satisfactory, environmentally friendly, and effective solution closer. The summation of all of these methods, together with increased public awareness and understanding of the issue, will enable individuals and communities to effectively combat Russian thistle. Although an iconic symbol of the American West might suffer, measures to control its growth and spread and influence understanding of the issue will make the American West a better
When he
place for all
tried
those
to
who
match
live
the
in it.
ranger with the big iron on his hip, big iron on his hip.